Good afternoon. My name is Megan Sniffen-Marinoff, and I am a university archivist at Harvard and also one of the many people who have worked to create the project that we will introduce you to today during this tour. I'm delighted to welcome all of you to the first in a series of events over the coming weeks that will reveal some of the work related to the Colonial North America at Harvard Library project. Today's presentation will focus on an exhibition in Widener Library in 2019 that highlighted items from across the Harvard libraries included in the Colonial North America project, or CNA as we call it, and have found new life in the digital realm. A second event, a conversation with curators about some of their favorite items from the Cna Collection and representing several of the libraries and archives that contributed to the project, will be held on Monday, March 15th at 3 p.m. A final multi-day symposium that will focus on the worlds opened up by digitization projects like this, including thinking about how machine learning and artificial intelligence might change the way we work with digitized manuscripts, will take place on April 6th, 7th, and 8th from 11 a.m. to 12 p.m. on each of those days. We hope that you'll be able to join us for all these events. So that you have some context for all of this, let me say a few words about the CNA project. The project began about 10 years ago with the understanding that the Harvard Library had a rich but untapped and not easy to access manuscript and archival resources collections from the 17th and 18th centuries relating to and what is loosely referred to as Colonial North America. If we could find a way to make not selections, but all of these materials, but all of the materials, and to make them accessible through digitization to people both inside Harvard and across the world, we believed we could contribute to the expanding and changing understanding of our collective past. A decade of surveying collections, locating and identifying materials in 15 of Harvard's libraries and archives, improving description, improving metadata, conserving materials enough to be handled for digitization, making images of these items, adding links to catalog records and other guides, and developing a website to make them even more approachable and accessible has now largely concluded. The Cna Collection consists of approximately 700,000 digitized pages of material. Each item is connected to countless stories of lives lived quietly and extravagantly, of encounters peaceful and volatile, and of places near and far, providing an opportunity to rethink familiar stories and to discover new ones. The digitized materials provide insights through the eyes of people who not only wrote about revolution and politics, but also topics such as education, trade, finance, law, science, medicine, religion, family affairs and social life, food and agriculture. The list is endless. The collections represent the lives also of women, indigenous, and enslaved peoples. Many of the documents contain visual materials such as drawings, sketches, maps, and other illustrations. In addition to reflecting the origins of the United States, the digitized materials also document aspects of life and work in geographical areas such as Great Britain, France, the Mediterranean coast, Canada, the Caribbean, and Mexico. Colonial North America is a term used loosely for this collection, with manuscript and archival collections naturally and inherently crossing the boundaries of identified timeframes. Before turning the program over to our speaker, I'd like to thank Grace Strong, Hannah Hack, Anna Burgess, and Monica Key for all their assistance in preparing this event. To Martha Whitehead and Francisca Frey, we thank you for many levels of constant support. Now, let me introduce Ross Mulcair, who is archivist for outreach, research, instruction, and special projects at the Harvard University Archives and one of the co-curators of the Widener Library exhibition. Ross.
Thanks, Megan, and hello, everyone, and thank you all for joining us this afternoon. As Megan mentioned, my name is Ross Mulcare, and I work at the Harvard University Archives, and I helped curate the exhibit we're going to look at in its physical analog form back in the pre-pandemic days. I was excited to learn that this exhibit would have a long digital afterlife, and I'm very excited to share with you all some of the items in this exhibit that I find particularly interesting, as well as some of the digital enhancements that we've made recently. Before we begin, I want to quickly demonstrate some of the features of the platform we're using to digitally explore this exhibit and Widener more generally. After this tour, we will make sure everyone gets the link to explore Widener on their own, which I would encourage you all to do. When you do that, you're going to be dropped initially into this room. And in fact, it's going to look something like this. This is the Mulcare reading room in Widener Library, and this is the starting point for the virtual tour of Widener. If you have perused real estate listings at all over the past few years, this interface should be pretty familiar to you. You may have also used Google Street View, which works similarly, just in outdoor spaces rather than inside buildings like this. This is basically a point and click interface though. You can put your cursor in a direction, click, and you will move or sort of walk virtually in that direction. You can also use the arrow keys on your keyboard to move around if you prefer. You'll notice a couple types of hotspots around. There's these semi-transparent sort of white dots on the floor. Those are the points that you can move between, and you'll see me doing that. And then there's these colored dots like this one here and this one back here that contain additional contextual information about the space. And I want to point out one additional feature that's tucked away here at the bottom of the screen as well. If you open up this little tray at the bottom, you'll see a set of preset points of interest within the library. These are going to let you jump around quickly within this model. And I want to go all the way over to the right and click on this one that looks out into Harvard Yard, where I want to start. So now I've warped onto the steps of Widener Library, looking out across Tercentenary Theater at Memorial Church. For those of you who have worked or studied at Harvard, this is a pretty familiar view, I would imagine, but one that I don't think many of you have seen, at least in the past year, for obvious reasons. If you've never been to Harvard, I wanted to offer this view to give you a sense of what's outside of the space that we're about to head into. You're looking into the heart of Harvard Yard here, and I would argue that Widener Library, the building that we're standing on the steps of, that dominates this space, is really the heart of the heart. So again, I want to welcome everyone to Harvard, at least virtually, and I want to head inside and take a look at this exhibit. So I am going to miss the door, and then I'm going to come back and walk in. So I want to get in this central area here. So just inside the main entry of Widener Library, you're going to notice, I'm going to slowly move around to not make people too dizzy here. You're going to notice several halls and stairwells that sort of pull your eye in multiple directions within Widener. I would encourage you all to really enjoy following all of these paths when you explore on your own, but I want to stop us right here in the entry in one of the most heavily trafficked areas of the library and look at these two halls flanking the room. So one is here and one is behind me here. These halls have not traditionally been spaces where we've had exhibits. It's only been over the past few years that we've really started to think about what stories we can tell to the thousands of people who pass through this area of Widener Library every day. When the opportunity arose to use this space to focus on materials from the Colonial North America project, we were really excited to be able to reach such a huge audience. As we started to think about how we might show off some of the incredible items from this time period, we were immediately faced with a challenge. How do you build a compelling exhibition when your pool of potential items amounts to more than 650,000 pages, now 700,000? I think there's a few right answers here that might work, but rather than narrowing down our focus to the point where we'd be leaving out thousands of these stories, we took a slightly different approach, which was to try to present in a visually compelling way precisely the huge scope of these collections and their contents. We wanted to pull items from all of the repositories, the 15 Megan mentioned, who participated in this project over the past decade, and really highlight the diversity of material and stories that can be found within those hundreds of thousands of pages. So as you can see from the title here, we've organized this exhibit around the concept of these historical documents being portals to the past. Because we wanted to show the breadth of material within these collections, we accepted that a narrow unifying theme or argument wasn't really achievable or even desirable. Instead, we considered the nature of these documents, especially the fact that they were composed by hand, not by printing, which gives them a sense of immediate intimacy. There's something innately compelling about reading letters or seeing sketches or peeking into the notebooks of people from the past. Knowing this and knowing that this area of Widener gets a lot of foot traffic, we wanted a big, bold visual presentation of these materials. Our intention was for passersby to be pulled into these documents to stop and consider what they were seeing and what stories are being told here. I want to note here that the items throughout this exhibit are not to scale, nor are they all shown in their entirety. We did lean toward showing full pages of text, which allows for more context to come through. But ultimately, this exhibit was about generating curiosity and engagement with immediate visual appeal. So we modified some documents in size and focus to draw the viewer's attention to specific things. I want to get into looking at some of these documents together in a moment, but also want to mention something kind of funny about what we're doing here this afternoon. What we're experiencing here together is really interesting because if you think about it, you're viewing here a digital representation of mounted prints in a real space. And those prints in turn were created from digital photographs of analog paper-based objects. And I think it speaks to the core power that these objects have, that they can survive that process. I don't think that these have that old effect of copying a copy of a copy, where whatever qualities the original might have had are lost. And again, I think there's something innately compelling about these manuscript materials that even these layers of mediated access can't erase. Before I continue and dive into the items, I do want to pause and thank a few of the key people, in addition to who Megan thanked, who helped make all of this possible. I want to first thank Kara Adams, who was the project manager for the Colonial North America project at the time we put this exhibit together, and whose knowledge of the project broadly and curatorial insights were vital to bringing all of this together. While I'm the one talking to you now, this is certainly as much Kara's exhibit as it was mine. And speaking of curators, I want to extend thanks to the curatorial staff members from all of the repositories represented here who provided suggestions for key items to include. And I also want to thank Katie Craig, the designer of the exhibit, who helped us think through how to organize and present these materials in a compelling way. Finally, thinking specifically about the digital version of this exhibit, I want to thank Matt Cook, our digital scholarship program manager, who led the effort to build this virtual model of Widener, as well as Drew O'Doherty, who spent many hours listening to recordings of me talking about some of these items in order to build the really incredible video content that's embedded here that I'll show you shortly. So I want to begin with something familiar so we can all get our bearings. The first item I want to share with you all comes from the Harvard University Archives, and it's right here. Sorry, I'm jumping around. It is right here. This is a watercolor painting from 1794 done by a man named Jonathan Fisher. Fisher was 25 or 26 when he created this work, and at the time was a graduate student at Harvard. Fisher is a really interesting figure because he's one of these people seemingly more common in this era than our own that seem to be good at everything, a true polymath. Fisher arrived at Harvard relatively late in life, being 20 when he came to Cambridge as an undergraduate, where his peers at the time would have been mostly 15 or 16 when entering the college. And Fisher's roving mind really served him well at Harvard and excelled in all of his courses. While at Harvard, Fisher refined his scientific and artistic eye, which you see reflected in some of the work he left behind from this period. There's this painting, of course, but I also want you to take a look at this earlier work by Fisher. And that's linked here, which you can look at on your own when you explore this as well. What you're seeing here is Fisher's mathematical thesis that he submitted to Harvard in 1791 as part of the requirement for his graduation. There are lots of these mathematical theses in our collections at the Harvard University Archives, many of which are really beautiful, but I think Fisher's has a quality that makes it stand out from the pack. What I like about the mathematical thesis is that what Fisher is ostensibly doing here is demonstrating his skill with measurement and perspective and 2D projection, which you can see on the left here. But in typical Fisher fashion, he takes this perspective sketch that proves his mathematical knowledge here and goes on to add this stunning painted version of it as well over here on the right, I think because he can, partly. So Fisher's life after Harvard continued to be marked by this wide-ranging set of skills. He went on to become the first congregational minister in Blue Hill, Maine, but also a notable writer, artist, architect, mathematician, and scientist. So really a fascinating figure whose work we're lucky to have in our collections. There's a few interesting things I want to point out about this painting in particular. One is that even 200 years later, I think this is an immediately familiar scene. I think you could put this in front of anyone, including perhaps even those who have never been to Harvard Square, and without showing them the sort of spoiler about where this is, they could tell you, there's a good chance they could tell you exactly where this is and what they're looking at. And I think this is a testament to Fisher's artistic eye, as none of these buildings are what I would now consider kind of the iconic Harvard buildings. I think you could make a case for Massachusetts Hall, which is this one on the right, as being iconic since it's the oldest building at Harvard that's still standing. But I think now most people associate Harvard with not the old yard here, but Tercentenary Theater, where we started, and especially the facade of Widener Library. This image it was actually used in CS50, which is Harvard's extremely popular undergraduate computer science, introductory computer science course that's offered not only to Harvard students, but sort of open public to the world. And when that course went fully remote in 2020, the professor, David Mallon, and the course's production staff contacted us to use this in the course, which you can see here. That's Professor Mallon at his podium. They wanted to use this as a backdrop for their course, leaning on it to communicate exactly that sense of Harvard to students all across the world, only a fraction of whom had ever set foot at Harvard. Later, when you explore this on your own, I encourage you to click on the hotspot that I clicked on to open this and really investigate this high resolution photograph. There are lots of similar views of Harvard Yard from around the same time period, but one of the special things about Fisher's view here is his manipulation of the paper he painted on. If you had the real object in front of you, you would immediately notice a sense of depth to the painting. Fisher achieved this by poking pinholes through the windows of the buildings, creating something that really leaps off the page when you see it in person. In the high resolution digital copy, if you know about the pinholes, and you can sort of see them here through my screen, but on your own, you'll certainly see them. You'll get a sense of that depth, and this takes on almost a three-dimensional diorama-like quality. One of the cool things we've been able to do with this exhibit in its digital form is enhance it with additional content, including not just those high resolution embedded videos, but curatorial video content as well. So I wanted to move down the hall a bit here and introduce you to another figure in Harvard's history.
What you're seeing here are 2 pages from a handwritten copy of a Hebrew to English vocabulary developed by a man named Judah Monas in the early 18th century. Born in 1683 in Italy, Monas was educated at the premier Jewish academies in Italy and the Netherlands, but eventually found his way to Colonial America when he immigrated to New York City in early 1716. Seeking an outlet for continued education and having a desire to share his knowledge with others, Monas looked to the north, to the growing college in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where he hoped his intellectual endeavors could be supported and sustained. At the time, Harvard's undergraduate curriculum included regular Hebrew coursework to facilitate close reading and interpretation of the Old Testament and rabbinical writings, but it lacked a proper instructor of Hebrew. Monas saw in Harvard's Hebrew faculty problem his opportunity to continue his own education and help better train the young scholars at the college. His credentials appealed greatly to Harvard's leadership, but there was one problem. Faculty at Harvard were required to profess a faith in Christianity. To take up his teaching career at Harvard, Monas would have to convert from Judaism to Christianity. He did just that, and in 1722 became Harvard's first instructor of Hebrew. Monas had a long career at Harvard, teaching from 1722 until his retirement in 1760. Many generations of young scholars learned Hebrew from Monas during these decades, and those he taught from 1722 to 1735 had a truly hands-on experience with their work. Monas had developed his own Hebrew grammar and supporting materials like the vocabulary shown here, and in the first decade and a half of his tenure, students were expected to copy, by hand, the entirety of Monas's instructional texts. Many copies of these student-created versions of the Hebrew grammar still exist. Here's just one example. This 1724 notebook, running for more than 100 pages, was copied by hand by 14-year-old Jonathan Trumbull, the future governor of Connecticut. Students could stop copying Monas's grammar by hand starting in 1735, when it was finally published and distributed throughout the American colonies. Notice, however, that access to a printed copy did not stop students from personalizing their texts. This 1735 copy of Monas's grammar was owned by Harvard student John Tucker, who, in 1738, decorated dozens of pages with notes, his signature in various styles, and even doodles of birds. You can learn more about Judah Monas, his work at Harvard, and his influence on generations of students.
So now that I have sort of explored the hyperlocal, thinking about Harvard, I want to turn behind us and come down the hall a bit further down here. So let's look at this end of the hall. There are some really incredible visual materials over here, but I want to draw your attention to one of the more unassuming documents on the wall, this one here. I'm going to zoom into this shortly, but I want you to be able to see it in context for a moment first. What you're looking at here is a laissez-passer, which was a document issued by the French government allowing for the free travel of a French citizen during the period of the French Revolution and the French Republic. I want to remind you that what you're seeing on the wall isn't to scale. This document is closer in size to a bank check than what you're seeing here. This is something that would have been carried around in a jacket pocket, so it's relatively compact in reality. This item is drawn from a collection of papers relating to the Jumel family that are held at Schlesinger Library. That collection mostly has materials from the 1780s, 90s, and into the early 1800s. So it really provides an intimate portrait of at least one family's experience during that period of tremendous global upheaval. And when I say intimate, I mean that quite literally in this case. The Jumel papers are full of dozens of love letters to and from members of the Jumel family, but also contain this travel pass. It's a really fascinating collection. I encourage people to look at it in more detail. So if we remember that each of these documents is meant to be a portal to the past, really an opening for further inquiry or closer inspection, I think that despite this being relatively unassuming visually, it's one of the more compelling documents up here. This travel pass was issued in July 1800 to citizen Jumel the Elder. And I'm not exactly sure which Jumel that is, but it's clear it's one of the Jumel men that was responsible for handling the family's business affairs. A few things I want us to notice and think about with this document. first is that it's in 1800, during the early years of the half-decade consulate of Napoleon. This is a period immediately following the French Revolution, but one where the French Empire was still undergoing serious convulsions. At the end of the 18th century, the Jumel family was doing business in the French colony of Saint-Domingue, now Haiti. And in 1800, when this pass was issued, the island was undergoing a revolution of its own, and in fact, in the midst of a civil war within that revolution. The so-called War of Knives, or War of the South, was underway in Saint-Domingue in 1799 and 1800. And that conflict saw the Haitian revolutionary Toussaint Louverture consolidate his power over the island, pushing his adversary André Rigaud, who had previously controlled the southern part of the colony, into exile. This was a really violent period with tens of thousands of troops fighting each other across Saint-Domingue and hundreds, if not thousands, of casualties. While this is happening, this travel pass suggests that Jumel the Elder had business to tend to in the colony that required him to move throughout the island, from Saint-Marc in the western segment of the colony to Gonaïves, slightly north of that, and then all the way over to Cap Français in the north, which was the commercial center and the biggest port of the colony. This is also where many of the huge sugar plantations were located, near Cap. I wasn't able to tell from my research precisely what type of business the Jumel family was engaged in, but this travel pass suggests that their connections throughout Saint-Domingue were pretty extensive and important enough to travel around the colony at this particularly violent moment. As a portal to the past, I think the Jumel travel pass is a helpful reminder, especially for those of us who are Americans, that early America was truly a vast global space. It's easy for us to slip into thinking about the 13 English colonies, about the story of the American Revolution, the birth of the United States, as really representative of colonial America. These are stories that as Americans, we grow up hearing and form a sort of core American mythology. This document is a pretty clear reminder that this is far too narrow of a conception of this period. The late 18th century was really an age of revolutions, not just one American revolution. And the economies and societies of the era were deeply linked across the Atlantic and especially throughout the Caribbean, which was the center of so much colonial wealth. In this exhibit, we've tried to have this broad view of North America and the Atlantic world in which it was situated. Let's take another quick trip back to the other hall and look at one final feature of the exhibit. Back over here in the Western Hall, I'd like to take a look at this wall, which you'll notice is slightly different than the other three walls. As you can see, we did want to narrow our focus down a bit here and decided to create this mini feature focused on autographs and signatures. As I've mentioned a few times, this exhibit generally really leans heavily on the innate appeal of personal handwritten or hand-created materials. As we were gathering items for the exhibit, we realized that signatures and autographs really encapsulate and concentrate that appeal. This is one of the reasons why collecting autographs has been a hobby both for amateurs as well as sometimes an organized effort by cultural heritage institutions like archives and special collections. As you might imagine, or you can see right here, there are no shortage of signatures within the Colonial North America collections, and we wanted to highlight a few of the particularly interesting ones. Just scan through these really quickly. So you may be noticing as you look at these, one of the more famous names on this wall, which is right here. We've got another short embedded video here that explores a bit about this item from Houghton Library and its creator.
You can't have a feature about signatures without a John Hancock, and Harvard Library is home to many versions of the famous patriot's bold autograph. Hancock's name at the bottom of the 1771 letter featured here is instantly recognizable. In size and form, it is almost identical to how it would appear on the Declaration of Independence 5 years later. While the Declaration would be a definitive political statement, on the 1st of January, 1771, Hancock's mind was more focused on matters of business and commerce. In this letter, Hancock writes to his business associate William Palfrey, who was preparing to sail to London in one of Hancock's ships. Having a trusted friend head to London was really a boon to him at this moment, as Hancock's import and export businesses were really struggling due to the increase in competition after the repeal of the Townshend Acts earlier in 1770. Hancock asked Palfrey to take a few outstanding bills to London and press the merchants there to settle their debts, tasking Palfrey to use your utmost endeavors to obtain payment either in whole or in part. In addition to getting paid money he was owed, Hancock was looking for additional business opportunities as well. He goes on to ask Palfrey to work with those same merchants to purchase oil, potash, and whale fins, which Hancock hoped to sell back in America. Hancock may have had money on the mind, but as ever, the lines between politics and business were a bit blurry. For over half a decade at this point, Hancock had been one of the most vocal proponents of non-importation agreements between American merchants. These were boycotts against British goods that Hancock and others felt were being unfairly taxed. Though the bulk of the offending British taxes had been lifted by 1771, Hancock knew his name might be associated with the era of boycott and protest. Undoubtedly, the non-importation plan will be much the subject of conversation, Hancock said to Palfrey, and my name perhaps will be frequently and freely used on the subject. I would desire you to state the matters fairly and with respect to me to represent the truth. Palfrey's commercial mission was one that Hancock knew would be laden with political implications. Hancock closed his letter, just above his bold signature, with a further suggestion for Palfrey when dealing with the British. I recommend to you to be prudent in all your conduct, particularly with regard to America, that you may honor yourself and your country. There are more than 1,300.
While there are several famous, powerful names on this wall, Hancock among them, also notice here Thomas Jefferson, King George III, King Louis XIV. There are also many lesser-known figures that tell very different stories about colonial North America. You can see up here, for instance, a document from the collections of the Harvard Law School Library. This is a paternity declaration signed by several women, Elizabeth Caswell, Sarah Dean, and a midwife named Mary Crossman. These documents are more humble, I would say, than the declarations by kings and founding fathers, but no less important for helping us think about what early America was like for the vast majority of people. I want to quickly return to looking at this Hancock document. And I want us to notice the document right above it as well. I think the juxtaposition of these two fragments of documents is helpful for illustrating how even just the style of handwriting or signature making can raise all sorts of questions and insights into these documents. Hancock's hand is consistent and trained, which would make sense considering Hancock came up through the elite education system of his day, which was to say through New England prep schools and then graduating from Harvard. Hancock's signature is, of course, famously embellished and ornate. Compare that to the hand and signatures of Hezekiah Squamig and Amos Ahatton just above it. This is a pretty stark contrast to Hancock and some of the other people on the wall. What you're looking at here is a petition from 1723 from Hezekiah Squamig and Amos Ahatton to the General Court of Massachusetts. Squamig and Ahatton were two native men living in Ponkapog, which you can see written out here at the bottom left of the letter. The native people living in Ponkapog at the time were a band of the Massachusetts tribe that had been living in what we would think of now as central eastern and southeastern Massachusetts, and they had been there long before English colonists had arrived. And in fact, the Massachusetts still are in this area and in Ponkapog. Ponkapog was actually the second of the so-called praying towns established by John Eliot in 1657 in order to Christianize and acculturate the native people of New England. Natick was the first and probably the most well-known. So by 1723, when Squamish and Powhatan are writing this, there's already been nearly 70 years of contact between the Massachusetts tribe and the colonial government of Massachusetts. The contact through that period was pretty complex, certainly marked by violence and dispossession, perhaps primarily marked by those, but also points of cooperation and what we might think of as today as international amity. So governments and people dealing with each other through established structures and processes, not just war and armed conflict. A lot of that complexity is wrapped up in this document, which when you can read it more closely on your own, you'll see that Squamish and Powhatan are essentially asking the general court to enforce the terms of previous agreements, namely that bounds of the Ponkapog plantation would be respected by English settlers. They're complaining here that their neighbors are not only encroaching on their lands, but chopping down trees and carrying them away for use or sale. And they're seeking redress from the government of Massachusetts to deal with this. So essentially, these colonists are continuing to profit from native land, even when that land was specified by law to be protected from exactly those offenses. Coming back to my original point, though, what I like about this document is that Squamish and Powhatan don't have the elegant hand of someone like Hancock, but they are just as adept at handling their business and working within the colonial structures that were effectively forced upon them, like the Massachusetts colonial government and legal system. So this seemingly hastily drafted document with its strike-through deletions and rough signatures is actually a sophisticated articulation of rights and a demonstration of native resilience and adaptation during this period. I'd like to wrap up and then have an opportunity for questions, comments, thoughts, insights. But before I do that, I want to offer perhaps an alternative way to think about this exhibit as you look at this on your own. So we framed this as portals to the past with the idea that any one of these could pull you into a different time and different place, helping you learn about the people, places, and events of the 17th and 18th centuries. When you explore this on your own later, I wonder if it might be useful to approach it as a series of portals, yes, but also something like a gallery full of mirrors. Even though we're separated by several centuries now, I think that each of these items reflects back something about us and our world now in the 21st century. As I continue to look into these documents, what I often see are reflections of everyday life now. I see people living their day-to-day lives, building relationships, working together, trying to understand a rapidly changing world, including even periods defined by epidemic disease and attempts to collectively fight against that. I also see, though, the origins of many of the ills that still plague us. I see reflected especially clearly here the massive accumulation of wealth by a relatively small group of people. I see the emergence of the idea of races and the elevation of some of those at the expense of others, most notably, of course, through the enslavement of African and Native peoples. And I also see the explosive growth of economies and societies built on exploiting and commodifying the natural world. These processes that started in or accelerated during the colonial period are certainly still with us, and I think that careful consideration of these documents can help us make sense of how we got to where we're at now. So I want to stop there and open up the floor, as it were, virtually for questions. If anything jumped out at you that you want to know more about, or any ideas you have that were spurred by talking through some of these. I'll stop sharing.
Ross, thank you very much for that. We do have several questions that have been submitted. And the first is one that I think you can address. It says the word colonial is increasingly problematic in jurisdictions like where I live in British Columbia with many First Nations groups. And this is something that we have talked about addressing in some way. Could you maybe just hint at what we're thinking of going forward?
Sure. So Jennifer, thank you for your question. That's really insightful and thoughtful, and it is something that we are sensitive to and thinking through. This name of this project, Colonial North America, has sort of stuck with it as the project has grown and shifted over the years. And it's one that we've gone back and forth on discussions about whether we should continue to use it or not, frankly. And currently, we are still using Colonial North America, partly for the reasons that I was suggesting at the end there, which is that we've been careful to not pitch this as celebrating the colonial era or celebrating colonialism itself, but instead try to show colonialism in the colonial period, the 17th and 18th centuries, warts and all. And I think we've done a really good job through this exhibit and through other programming focused on the Colonial North America project at really highlighting that this is not all about the triumph of European settlers over the so-called New World. This is a complicated, often ugly place, and all of that is encapsulated in this term, Colonial North America. So we are thinking, though, about ways that we might rebrand or reframe this project going forward. We're not quite there to be announcing anything yet, but it is something that is on our minds as well.
Great, thank you, Ross. Another question, could some of the differences in penmanship be attributable to materials available to the authors?
Yes, I think certainly that some of the, yes, the short answer is yes. I think that people have access based on their status or their wealth to certain instruments or paper types at various points, and certainly access to education in the early period will tell you or dictate a lot about what your penmanship looks like. So for instance, back on the wall of signatures, there are many women signatures and the hands of women writing there. Those women who were literate almost certainly were not educated in the same way as someone like John Hancock, who had gone through all of this sort of training and schooling. So it's sort of natural that their handwriting would not be as tutored. And some of that has to do with the implements available to them, but also just that access to education.
Thank you, Ross. Here is another. This is quite an eclectic group of materials. Is this representative of the whole collection, and how was it acquired?
So, complicated answer, perhaps. I think it is representative, as I was suggesting, of materials drawn from all of the repositories that have participated in this project. So each of those repositories, you saw something from the law school, from Houghton Library, from the university archives. There's things from Countway Library at the medical school, and so on. All of those appear here. So it's representative in that way. I would say that we selected things, though, favoring their sort of visual presentation. And that is not representative of the collections, the 700,000 pages as a whole. I think you would find far more something more akin to what I was showing you at the end, which is like bills of sale, receipts, and record keeping. So papers that record things that are happening in log books or something like that, ledger books. Those, I think, form really the bulk of the Colonial North America collections. Those are not as immediately visually arresting as some of the things we showed here. But I will say, if you spend the time with those documents, they are the things that really reveal the kind of contours and complexities of the time.
Thank you. I have a sort of a grouping of sort of technical kind of questions. I'm not sure how much you can answer, but we'll try here. It says, what kind of camera and related equipment was used to capture the environment What resolution was it recorded in and outputs to?
I saw that question come in, and I'm afraid I can't answer it with much specificity. So when I was introducing or talking earlier in the presentation, Matt Cook, our digital scholarship program manager, would be the person to talk to about the sort of digital specifics about this. And Matt would be, I'm sure, happy to take this question and we can follow up to detail. I think those technical questions are really interesting because they've made possible this new way of getting at this exhibit. So maybe that's something we can build into the Colonial North America project website, is sort of a description of the tech that's making this possible as well. But I don't have an answer myself.
Sure. One other that maybe you could answer, which is, will you be using this virtual format to present materials in the future, and is it difficult to put together?
So the first part of that question is absolutely, I think we will use this digital format more frequently. We found that when we were photographing this space in Widener, that the resolution to, and this goes back to the previous question, the resolution was high enough that you can really look at this exhibit pretty closely just by walking through here in this platform. But as you saw, you can also embed higher resolution images. You can embed links to related items and objects, and you can do sort of lay over a curatorial layer digitally as well. That's really powerful, and I think probably the future of these types of exhibitions. Is it a lot of work? Absolutely. I wasn't myself involved with sort of building this model, but I was with embedding the video content, with embedding the images, and of course, sort of putting on this presentation to walk through it. And it's a lot of work. It's very different than if you were at Widener Library in person with me and I was walking through here. Those, it's a different type of presentation. This requires much more planning and this embedding of material that otherwise you wouldn't necessarily need to do.
Great, thank you, Ross. Ross, are there ways that you think the digitized image of a document changes or enhances our understanding of it?
Yes, it's a really great question. I think that the digital offers up some strengths and some downsides. So let me address the strengths first. One of the amazing things with digitized documents is that you can, they're so high resolution, especially now, that you can zoom way in on them. You can get to a level of granularity and detail that otherwise, if you were looking at these in a reading room, for instance, in person, that you just can't get to. That can be really revealing. It reveals something else that you don't necessarily get in person. I also think, speaking of reading rooms, there's a real benefit to digital, which is that you can essentially take these things home. This is all accessible. All these 700,000 pages are accessible right on your laptop or your desktop, and you can kind of combine and curate them yourselves. You can put things from Houghton Library right alongside things from the Graduate School of Education special collections. You can really do that in a way that doesn't require you to travel to all of these reading rooms, and you certainly can't take these things out of reading rooms. So this allows you to have them all together and put them in conversation with each other. The downsides of digital, there are several, one of which I think is that you can lose a sense of scale and materiality. So this exhibit, as I suggested, we sort of did away with the idea of scale and we blew things up to be big just for visual appeal. In reality, when you're studying something, it's often very helpful to know how big it is. So for instance, the French travel pass, seeing that in person, you immediately understand the size of it and how it would be used at that time. It would be tucked in a jacket pocket, it would be carried around. You lose that on the screen because you don't necessarily have a sense of how big something is or what it might have been used for based on its size like that. Yeah, I think that sort of covers the materiality bit as well. You know, digital photos, even in a high resolution, are pretty flat. They are certainly 2D. They're often photographed straight down. You don't get the same texture of the paper. You can't hear and feel the document that you're holding. And there's kind of a power to that that's hard to define, that touching something that was held 300 years ago has its own charm and own power. But also you can learn a lot by closely examining the paper, by touching it, by looking at it closely, seeing the fibers. You can learn about the material of the time period.
I have a question here that I'm not sure you can answer, but I think that you might be able to provide a reference. It says, I am transcribing from John Hancock's Book of Letters, and I have two questions. One, on page 143, John mentions that he had bought parcels of books from booksellers on Paternoster Row in London for his college library in Cambridge. I know the library, up until the year 1764, had consisted of the books of that Reverend John Harvard had left to the college but had burned down. I'm assuming that John was purchasing these books as a way to rebuild the collection.
Yeah, so that's interesting. That's not, I assume if the question is that what's happening here? I'm not really sure. And that is a story, though, that's pretty fascinating. That's a story that I can bet is documented in our collections. Likely, this sounds like it might be at the collections of the Harvard University Archives, where we would have administrative records, including sort of early library records that might detail exactly that, about how these books are flowing in and out and how Hancock would have been involved in that. It's not something I know intimately myself, though. I will say the transcription of this material is really exciting, and something I did want to mention that's been part of our use of the Colonial North America materials is more recently putting these digitized materials into a platform from the page, which allows crowdsourcing or collaborators across the world to come together, look very closely at these documents and transcribe them, making them even more accessible and useful for research. So this isn't a question that came up, but it's something that I want to mention, is that you can search by keyword for anything within these collections in the Colonial North America website. You cannot yet search within the text of these documents, but that's something that is changing, and really kind of the cutting edge of where we're headed with these manuscript documents is to be thinking about how can we look at the content within them so that we can uncover all kinds of new stories that have previously been sort of buried in hundreds and hundreds of pages of handwritten material. So we have this transcription crowdsourcing project, and then in April at our 3-day symposium, one of our panels will focus partly on the potential for machine learning or AI to also get at the content of these materials, which is really exciting. And these materials are going to support that work going forward, which is great.
Another question is, I noticed when you were scrolling a table with a feather on it. Could you please explain what that was?
Yes, I should have pointed that out. And in fact, I can walk back down there and show it to you very quickly. So in the autographs and signatures area of this exhibit, there is indeed a table and a feather right here. So like any exhibit, we wanted to have a guest book, or a place where people can record that they came through here and record their thoughts or reactions to this. This hallway here has some of the central administrative offices of the library behind these doors. So lots of guests to the library come through here as well. And we wanted to give people sort of a sense of contributing to this type of thing, adding their own signatures and their own handwriting, and thinking about, what do these items tell you about these people, but also consider your own signature and your own penmanship. What does that tell you about yourself? So we tried to build the guest book basically into the theme of this wall of the exhibit. And this guest book will certainly become part of the collections at Harvard Library as well.
Thank you. Well, we have run out of time, and let me just acknowledge that there are some more technical questions that for any of you that have written in those questions, we will save them and try to answer them afterwards. I think we can probably answer all of them. for people, but let me just thank everyone for attending this event. Thank you, Ross, for all of your work and everyone that has been mentioned. And I just want to remind people that we have 2 more events coming up, one on March 15th, where we will have numerous curators going into depth about items they've selected to discuss. And on April 6th, 7th, and 8th, we're really kind of moving into a new realm beyond digitization, talking about the effect of all of this on teaching and research, and also, again, how AI and machine learning will affect some of the work that we have going forward to make this material even more accessible. So thank you again, Ross, and thank you everyone for attending.
Thanks, everybody.